So welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of Urban Transport Next Conversations with a live online audience on the topics that will help determine the future of urban transport. So whether you're spending your lunchtime with us listening live, or whether you're listening to the podcast later or watching the playback on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Bray, Director of the Urban Transport Group, the organisation that's hosting these events. For those of you who don't know us, we bring together the transport authorities for the largest urban areas in the UK, so Transport for London, Transport for West Midlands, Transport for Greater Manchester, and the authorities serving all the other major metro areas, about 20 million people in total. So as well as being a body that thinks ahead about what next for urban transport, our members can implement that thinking on the ground, and we can and we do learn collectively from these events. I'm really pleased that so many people have signed up to take part in this event and delighted that we can offer you such a stellar panel for this conversation on what next for urban transport after the pandemic. And as I say, we couldn't have better speakers on this for you. We have Laura Shoaf, who chairs our network of transport authorities in the UK, as well as being the Chief Executive of Transport for West Midlands. And we have Mohamed Mezghani, who is the General Secretary of the Global Public Transport Network, UITP. UITP represents everyone from operators, organising authorities, the supply industry, and everyone in between on public transport right round the planet. And the host for the conversation is Philipp, Executive Director of LSE Cities, part of the London School of Economics. LSE Cities is one of the global centres for thinking about the future of cities, including their transport systems and networks. So you can also be part of this conversation by putting questions. Keep them short and sharp, please, via Zoom. You can also vote for the questions you most want answered. We'll be picking these up in the final section of the conversation. You can also use the comments channel of the Zoom call. And of course, you can also use Twitter with the hashtag UTGNext. So that's hashtag UTGNext. So with that, I will now hand over to our host, Philipp.
Jonathan, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to now take over as chair and interviewer as part of this event. A very important focus, obviously. This doesn't require a lot of introduction, that we need to think hard and clear about the future of urban transport. And given who is with me on the panel, there will of course be a big emphasis on the backbone of urban transport, and that is of course public transport. So let me just introduce the structure, and then we'll have a quick round of sort of individual introductions by our guests. We'll have about 40 minutes for the conversational part, and we'll structure that in 4 rounds. And then we'll have the 15 minutes Q&A. So do make active use, as Jonathan suggested, of the Q&A option. We'll start initially with a reflection about the past 12 months, the big disruption through the pandemic, but ultimately are then going to focus on 3 aspects of looking into the near and medium term future. The first is really in relation to what is happening on the ground by the key actors in the urban transport space. The second one is looking at national government and the role of national governments. And then the last one is really understanding how we may have to reframe urban transport in the political debate much more as a public good with all its implications. But as I said, let's begin now with a very quick round of introductions where I'd like to ask Laura and then Mohamed to briefly tell us how they ended up in the transport space, so we have a better idea who is speaking to us today. Laura.
Thank you, Philip. I studied to be a planner. So I have a degree in urban planning from NYU, New York University, which is where I come from. And it's through my interest in planning, which is really about the entirety of those spaces and urban spaces in particular, and how they work and how they function, and how they move people, that I started to sort of focus in on transport. And that still today frames my passion and my interest in the topic of transport, which is transport in and of itself, if it's not well designed and planned, doesn't do anything for anybody. But when it is well thought through and it thinks about where people need to be, where they want to start and finish their journeys, and how important that mobility is to cities and the people that live within them, as well as to other areas, that's where I sort of came interested in transport and where I have that passion for transport. And I particularly am interested and passionate about cities, including Birmingham, which is where I now live and work.
Thank you very much, Laura. Mohamed.
Yes, actually, I have always been working in the field of sustainable mobility for more than 30 years now. It started during my industrial engineering studies. It was in Tunisia. We had a visiting professor who delivered 1 week course on transportation. And for me, it was a discovery. And I liked very much that course and decided to take a postgraduate program on transport in Paris. So I moved to France. And then after that postgraduate program, I started my career in urban mobility, first in a public agency dealing with transport energy efficiency on how to depollute, let's say, transport, then as a consultant for technical assistance projects funded by development banks and cooperation agency, mainly in developing countries or countries in transition. And later I joined UITP, where I held various positions until I took over the position of Secretary General in 2018. I must say that public transport is not just my professional sector, and like Laura, it's a passion. I believe in the values it carries because they are related to social inclusion, to people's well-being, to sharing, and it pursues a noble cause, and that's why I made that choice to serve this industry. So I'm very happy and proud actually to work in and for public transport.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. Now, as I said, we want to really focus with this talk on the future. But I think it's only appropriate, given the almost 12-month, or in many countries, more than 12-month reflection on the pandemic, to also briefly remind ourselves how this dynamic of lockdowns, of pandemic control played out on the ground in the context of your jobs. What were the priorities? What are the critical moments you remember since in sort of many of the countries you're working in, it is pretty much exactly 1 year since COVID hit us that hard. And how were you able to support your organizations? Let's again start with Laura, a bit of a reflection of these very, very difficult months.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of reflecting lately, and it is amazing, like most things, when you're in the middle of something that is sort of born of a crisis, you get through it, don't you? And it isn't until after you come to some sort of a calmer state that you can then turn back and think, gosh, there was ever such a lot that we did and how well we did it. But for us, at first it was crisis management, just trying to make sure as a priority. And I think what has driven us all throughout this has been keeping our passengers and our employees safe. But figuring out how to source face coverings and vinyls, so that tell people how they can be 2 meters apart exactly, and where to line up, and information, and trying to distribute sort of those things on mass scale was something we had not done before. But again, we have great networks both in this country and then around the world through UITP and other partners where we could learn best practice from other places and not have to start from scratch. Take really good ideas that have happened elsewhere and make them happen as soon as you can. We discovered it's not hard to shut a network down at all, but it's really quite difficult to start one back up again. So the sort of accordion style of, expanding services, reducing services, expanding services, reducing services is really challenging on anything from information, but especially what you want is people to be safe and feel and know they are safe. So probably the biggest things that we did, I think, which were on reflection, the most powerful was we took a decision to distribute across all of our networks free face coverings, which we have not stopped actually, and we thought we would, but we haven't, because it means a lot to passengers to know if somebody else is traveling who doesn't have a face covering, that somebody will give them one. And also it's been really good for our employees because it's a diffusing situation. So being able to distribute free face coverings as a decision that we made was great. We also repurposed some of our vehicles so that we could give free travel to our NHS staff who are moving between rail stations and our key hospitals. And those were in the moment decisions we made, just trying to make sure we asked ourselves, are we doing everything we can for our passengers and for our employees? And that was the one question that guided us throughout the whole thing.
Thank you very much, Laura, and clearly an experience very, very much on the ground with your city region, really helping, and you know, that also, I guess, very much resonates with your earlier explanation around how much, you know, ultimately caring about transport is caring about a city, a place, a region. Mohamed, your organization is different. You are sitting in the central command and control tower of UITP, overseeing, you know, many, many different organizations such as Laura's, helping them, assisting them. What did this mean to you? Where did you find the role, how, and then also UITP's role to facilitate the urgent needs your partners on the ground had the best?
Yes, indeed, I have a different role compared to Laura. Laura manages a network of public transport network. We manage a network of networks, I would say. We have 1,800 members in UITP from 100 countries. So with different preoccupations and different concerns, but this pandemic, when it hit the world, actually, all of them were equal, because no one experienced such a pandemic. In Asia, they had the first experience with in the early 2000s, but with a different scale. And so our role was first to support our members, to support them, to reassure them that they are not alone in this with this issue, that the other networks and the other organizations, they are experiencing the same problem, but also we learned from those who where the pandemic was touched them earlier, before the others. So in Asia mainly. So we learned from our members there, and I remember the first crisis meeting, which was organized late February 2020 and early March with our Asian members, to learn from them and then to share this information. We published our first paper at the end of February about the coronavirus, how to manage coronavirus in public transport networks. Then that paper was the starting, let's say, of many actions, several actions and several meetings with members to share knowledge and to make them feel belonging to a community that is having the same kind of problems, but that is also working together, collaborating together to find solutions. Also, one important role was to advocate for public transport, because unfortunately there were a lot of misinformation, also a lot of stigmatization of the public transport networks, that it is contaminating and that is carrying the virus, so that the people will catch the virus when traveling in public transport, etc. So we organized our communication to speak to the policymakers, but also to speak to the media, to the press. We had a lot of interviews, a lot of press releases and papers disseminated to correct this. And you know, now after 1 year, it appeared that we were right. I mean, now no one talks anymore about the risk of contamination in public transport. We talk about the risk of contamination in restaurants, in bars, in family gatherings, etc. But we don't talk anymore about public transport. But at the same time, the public transport networks, they have introduced new disinfection and cleaning techniques. There are new practices that makes people feel even safer in public transport. So this advocacy was very important indeed.
Thank you very much. I mean, yes, it turns out that one thing we always missed a bit in public transport, that we don't socialize enough with people we don't know, was going to be a big advantage in the end. Silent in the crowd was, of course, the big advantage which public transport had over other large social spaces. So let's now move to the future. And, you know, it's in some ways difficult because we actually don't know when the pandemic is actually going to really end. But we also had already 12 months to not just rush to sort out a crisis, but in parallel, and many of efforts have been launched, whether it's the network of the networks of Mohamed or the networks itself, to think through what are the big pressure points we expect coming up in the next months and years, how recovery could look like, what kind of innovations can be carried forward, and how, maybe most importantly, we can use a certain political momentum to get back to some of the big issues which we always knew had to be dealt with in the urban transport sector. What are your strategies? What are sort of the ideas that are coming up? And Laura, let's start with you, but we can then really make this very interactive and bounce back ideas here and there as well.
Thank you. We're not out of the pandemic yet. We were having that conversation before we started, where we feel there's quite a lot of hope and optimism, but we're not through it yet. For us, some of the biggest pressures are the balance of, while we still are maintaining social distancing, as we start to make changes to what's allowed, you obviously need to run more vehicles more frequently to allow social distancing to take place. So how do we manage where we just may be starting to see more people returning to public transport, which is exactly what we want, but while we still have to maintain social distancing, so it puts pressure on capacity. And until we get to that spot where we are both allowing people to travel freely and there is no social distancing, it's about that moment. And that feels like a really important thing for us, because we want people to return and feel confident and safe. And getting that right through that transition period is really important, because the last thing we want is people to make their first journey back and to think that either it wasn't managed properly, it didn't feel safe, there were too many people on a vehicle, and make them uncomfortable and retreat back off of public transport. So that's probably the pressure. I'm happy to stop there, or I can talk a little bit more about recovery, however you want.
Why don't we pause here, because it's such an important point you're raising. It's to ensure, once there is even a little increase, which may in some countries already happen now in ridership, that those that return, some of them after indeed 12 months having not been on a train, a bus, an underground, that they have an experience which is reassuring. The last thing we want is people going back home and saying, never again, I really felt uncomfortable. Mohamed, how are you helping your partners to make sure that this moment of opening up will be a moment of success and reassurance and confidence building?
Yeah, so that's an important question indeed, because we need to restore trust in public transport, the trust that we lost during this year. And if we want to restore trust, we need to restore at two levels. Of course, there are the, let's say, but by acting on rational behaviors, I would say, by disinfecting, by cleaning, by calling people on how to use public transport, or by educating people on how to use public transport, but by avoiding the crowd, of course, and then better managing the supply in a way that we flatten the peak when we operate public transport. Also by using tools which will better manage the crowd. We see all these apps. Also the way we operate, the flexible operation of public transport will make it possible to manage crowd. So we have this, this is the rational approach, but there is also the emotional approach, how we can make people have positive feelings about public transport, how we can also make people be proud of using public transport, because they know that if they use public transport, they will contribute to a better planet, to a cleaner environment, to more social inclusion, etc. So we need to act on the two levels, really, to show that we, the public transport operators and organizations, are doing their homework to clean, disinfect, better operate, and provide a better service, but at the same time inspire positive feelings and educate also the people to use it the right way, I would say. And also something important is that we have realized during this crisis that public transport is essential. We have seen during those lockdowns period, we see it again because there are unfortunately still some cities and counties where there is lockdown, and we have seen how essential it is because it carries the essential workers and those in the frontline workers, etc. So this role of public transport, we need to build on that, to capitalize on that really, and to use this to convey a positive image about public transport.
And Mohamed, just to follow up on this, has UITP developed any form of recommendation about load factors depending which stage of the pandemic you are in, where you would advise don't fill your carriages beyond a certain density, or are there standards where you advise, or are you trying to actively not do that?
Look, of course, we work on that issue. When I mentioned earlier the flattening the peak, I mean, we have a whole work program on that and involving a lot of members on that. I don't think that we will go so far in recommending quantitative, let's say, limits not to be exceeded, because first we consider that when people have the right behavior, when also the vehicles are clean, disinfected, etc., we don't need to have these limits. Actually, we don't need to have these limits. So the limits are more needed not from a sanitary or from a health perspective. They are needed more for comfort. If you want people to travel in comfortable conditions, then yes, we need those limits, and that's why we want to, let's say, flatten the peak and encourage people to travel outside of peak hours. There are some networks, for example, who are offering free access to their network before 7 a.m. to encourage people to travel earlier outside of the peak hour. So these kind of measures, we try to promote these kind of measures. Also, what I mentioned earlier, these apps which are tracking the occupancy of vehicles and trying also to encourage people to even their positioning on the platform, where they position themselves on the platform to avoid the crowd. So this kind of application of projects, yes, it's our role to collect the information, to disseminate to our members.
Thank you very much. Now, you hinted at something which is going to be really important for the future. That is about the comfort of public transport. And I want to come back to Laura and just ask her, if I were to take public transport in Birmingham at the moment, I'm assuming it's quite likely that I could find a seat and I will be able to enjoy my ride throughout in a very comfortable position. Now, that's a quality which I wondered you are discussing internally as something you may want to push into the future. Is this a conversation to, essentially provide public transport users with the comfort other motorized transport users would always assume they have the right to, which is the seat?
Well, absolutely. If it's we can get you on an essential journey to Birmingham, I can guarantee you a seat at the moment. Partially because we also are taking good care to monitor and not let people onto vehicles that are crowded. But I think there's a big piece of work to do here with business. So Mohamed made a really good point about flattening the peak. And it's the same in most cities. There are points in any day when there are no seats available. And then for the majority of the rest of the time, there's capacity. I think we've learned that many people, not all people, but many people can do elements or parts of their job successfully in a more flexible way. And there certainly seems to be quite a lot of discussion about how will people return to work, in what way, into office buildings, and will it be a more flexible approach? This is where we need to be really, really proactive with business, because from being parochial, from a transport perspective, it is better for me and better for businesses to have people be able to travel in at 11 if that suits them, and then leave at a different time, or not have all that pressure on the network in those peaks. And I think we were moving towards a more flexible sort of commuting and live-work balance before this, but it's been brought into sharp focus. So I think there's a big opportunity here, one we have to do with partners in business, as I said, working in the UK with the chambers, to try to understand how they can give that message. And they're telling us that their members are really concerned about understanding how they're going to be able to use public transport to return. So it's important that we see that life come back into our urban areas, but we do that really thoughtfully with businesses in a way that means that comfort can be given to all passengers. Nobody likes to stand for their entirety of their journey. That is not as pleasant as being able to sit down. There's no two ways about that. So I actually think it gives us an opportunity to accelerate a conversation that we've needed to have for quite some time.
Thank you.
If I may.
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, I mean, no, because your question made me think about the fact that I prefer to stand during 20 minutes in a crowded bus rather than sitting 1 hour in my car in a traffic jam. Yeah. So I think we need to really make people think about not just about sitting or standing, but about the service which is rendered by public transport compared to the impacts that the car traffic and the nuisances that car traffic is generating. I think it's important that we don't consider public transport separately or from the rest of the traffic of the transport modes.
Oh, you're absolutely right, and there is of course also a quality of being moved while standing. That is in itself something which is actually can be quite desirable. Mohamed, myself as a student in transport, the 1990s, flattening the curve, this has been around for a long time. The inefficiencies of the peak, getting rid of it or moving it. A lot of research at the moment suggests we maybe, with knowledge workers, come from a 5 day per week in the office to maybe something like 2 or 3. What would actually help you and your partners much more is if we have a temporal spreading, as Laura just suggested. Some people may be coming much earlier, others maybe for lunchtime or in the later afternoon. Are these conversations where you are helping your partners on the ground to re-engage with businesses? Many of them, just like your own organization, are networked organizations, global firms, employees across the world. Is there something happening which is beyond just the individual city scale? Let's come together and think about our schedules, but maybe a more concerted push that we need a sustainable transport hour or flexible work hours, which goes beyond just individual transport commuter sheds.
No, certainly there are a lot of discussions between the transport stakeholders and the businesses and the Chamber of Commerce, universities, all poles, I would say, generating mobility. So there are a lot of discussions on that. The problem is that, when we define the supply in a public transport system, when we define the infrastructure, we define it based on the peak hour. That's the problem we have in public transport. So the cost we invest to satisfy the peak hour demand. And so it means that once we have invested and once we have the vehicles, we have the infrastructure, etc., we need to make the optimal use of it. So what you are telling about working three days a week and having a different mobility behavior, certainly this is something we have to take into consideration. But it will not have an impact on the short and medium term. It will have an impact on the longer term. So because the network have already invested, the offer, the supply is there. The problem even is that it is now costing more than before, because in addition to the existing costs, we will have to disinfect and clean and try to limit the crowd, etc. We are introducing new tools, new technologies in public transport systems, and this is coming with additional costs. So you see the challenge we have is that the cost is increasing, but the revenues will be lower because there are less people using public transport currently. So this is the challenge we have in public transport. One of the challenges, of course.
Yes. Now let's move to another area where actually quite a bit of innovation is happening, experimentation, testing in urban transport. And it's not public transport, it's much more about the use of streets and street space. And to what degree it's the place function versus the movement function. In the UK, we have these experiments about low traffic neighborhoods. Many cities have pop-up bike lanes and some sort of tactical urbanism with ideas of extending the bars and who knows what into the street. And I'm curious to understand, because this is, you know, a big thing for the public. That's what they see. That's how they, at the moment, experience also urban change. How much can public transport become a partner of essentially a new proposition about public space, street space? And where do you also see potential tensions with what is being experimented with? So curious to understand the attitude of, you know, the backbone of urban transport, public transport, in relation to where the political heat is at the very moment. Laura, maybe you want to kick us off. I'm sure you have a few low traffic neighborhoods in Birmingham.
We do. And lots of pop-up cycle lanes and widening of or taking parking bays out for extension of seats for outdoor seating and allowing more of that outdoor socialization to take place. And it's not without debate. And I don't know that we've got the answers yet. But what we did do in a number of sort of different moments through the pandemic is do quite a lot of online research as to how people were thinking and feeling about what was happening. And what was really interesting was even probably 6 months in, we had an overwhelming response of people saying there were things that they were enjoying, and that was quieter streets, quieter skies, physically themselves being able to do more walking, roads being a little more safe for cycling, more space to be out and speaking to each other. So I think we learned something in the pandemic, and I think that Mohamed made some really good points about connecting to the emotional side of everyone has a role to play in helping to reduce our carbon footprint. Everyone has a role to play as a member of society, and I think you know, we've all had to look at the collective through this and understand how collectively we have impact. But spaces clearly need to be for everyone, and that is for everyone. And designing those spaces, to me, is hugely important. It brings that urban planner out that I'm trying to focus just on transport. But if you think that transport is the backbone of how it works, we need to make sure that those places are accessible to everyone, and public transport has a role to play in that. But they're also that we plan them in a way where the network doesn't segregate the space. And to me, the tension sits between whether, you know, how you both make those spaces accessible, bring people as close as you possibly can into them by public transport, but don't let the network itself sort of dissect the space. And I think that is the challenge. Lots of people want those spaces to be without what they perceive to be noisy, smelly buses. But of course, those buses are the veins that bring the blood. You know, that's how we bring people in, and we make sure that those places are accessible to everybody and socially integrated. So I think there is a challenge, but if people can't get to them to use them, they won't be good for everyone. So they have to be designed with accessibility in mind.
Thank you. Yeah,
I think this space issue is a key one. Really. And when you look to the cities during lockdown period, and we discovered how much space is dedicated to cars. We discovered with all these empty roads, you know, that the car is occupying a lot of space. And I see that we focus a lot on the environment, on the climate change, on pollution, and we don't talk enough about how best to use the space in the city. And what we risk now, if we focus much on pollution and not enough on space, is that we end with clean traffic jams. We end with zero emission cars, but occupying the road space. So, and the clean traffic jam is still traffic jam anyway. So it's important really that we tackle all these issues together, that we don't focus on environment, and then we will deal with safety, and then we will with road safety, and then we will deal with the space, etc. So we have to tackle or to address all these challenges together. And here it's about designing cities for people. Really, I mean, during 100 years we had this interlude, I would say, where we have been designing cities for cars. Now we have to start designing cities for people. And then we come back to what you were talking about, Jonathan, and Philip and Laura, about the road space shared for walking, for cycling, for dining, etc., etc. So that's how we want our cities to be.
Yeah, thank you very much. And such an important reminder that that's a progressive agenda which needs to stay with us for the sake of the cities and its residents. Now, I have to move us on to really come to possibly the single most important issue at the present moment, and it's about finance. And I want to link that to national governments as well. And in some ways, Laura earlier described what you could consider a scissoring effect, whereby on the one hand, you need to actually provide even more costly services to keep the rolling stock out there, have a lower number of riders and lower income. Therefore, your costs may actually be higher, but you have less revenue through the fare box. Now, of course, many national governments and in some areas also state level governments have stepped in. They have been arguably quite generous, rightly so. But there is a question of what is happening now beyond these bailouts and these packages that were provided as a one-off. There's very optimistic noise coming out of the United States, where the new US Secretary for Transport, Pete Buttigieg, suggested he is working for a moonshot program for mobility, really unusual commitment by the federal government in Washington to help public transport systems. Maybe because he was a mayor, that's more obvious to him. What are our agendas? How should we, ask for the right kind of financial tools to be made available for the right kind of support? And Mohamed, let's start with you. You have the global overview. This must be the number one question many of your partners will want to hear from you. How can we negotiate with our national governments? How can we make the case that we are important? And how can we get to finance models which are more sustainable?
Yes, I think this question related to national government is really a very important one. And I think the first step is to make them recognize the benefits of public transport. This is the one important issue we have, that public transport is seen as a cost. It is not seen as an investment for a better city, for healthier mobility. And so we need to convince them that public transport is not just a mode of transport. It contributes to a city which is more dynamic, more prosperous, which it contributes to better road safety, etc., etc. So we all know the benefits of public transport. So we need to really make them accept this, to convince them that this is what public transport can bring to the city. And if they accept this, if they admit it, then it will be, I would say, easier to talk with them about the funding, about the how to support financially the sector, not just in time of crisis, but about a new funding scheme for public transport. And then maybe this is what is happening in the US. I mean, we are all surprised that these innovations or this commitment is coming from the US. We are not used to that. And maybe that's what, because maybe the transport secretary is realizing all these benefits. So that's what we, and also if we succeed to do that, we will stop having this double language of the governments, or who on the one hand, they will maybe talk positively of public transport, but on the other hand, the first sector they will support is the car industry or the aviation industry, and not the public transport sector. So we need to have this discussion with them. What is good is that with this crisis, we have much more interaction with the governments, much more interaction also with the supranational authorities like the European institutions, for example, which in the European Union regulate a lot of public aspects of public transport. So that's good. I mean, public transport is on the agenda, or mobility, urban mobility is on the agenda. It's to us to use this opportunity to convince them, and to bring also to bring them think about solutions like congestion charging. I mean, to encourage the government to define the right regulatory framework for congestion charging, for example, for land value capture. So all these tools that are at our disposal, but they are not yet deployed in our cities.
Thank you, Mohamed. And as you were speaking, with also your references to car industries and aviation, it's actually intriguing that we so rarely hear about the number of jobs, the contribution to the economy in aggregate terms of the public transport systems in a country. Most people, in many countries will be aware of how many people will be employed in key industries, because it's constantly being used. That's why we need to do this and that. And I hope we'll hear much more about this contribution. I mean, translate the contribution of public transport providers into actual number of jobs, into actual number of GDP contribution, whatever it may be. I think at the moment, there is a real opportunity still. Laura, what is it you would want to add on that really important point, how we make the case?
I would reiterate everything that Mohamed just said. I support all of it, and it is part of the social network. It's part of the infrastructure. It's the beating heart of places, and I think it has been recognized more now through the past 12 months as to the fact that it is essential, not optional, and it's proven itself to be. And it's done what it's been asked to do in countries all over the world, which is keep moving, keep passengers safe and moving, and networks have done that. I think I would just add from probably a UK perspective, I hope that we take the opportunity to stop thinking about how we compensate by mode and think about how we fund a network. So, we often talk about there's a package here for rail funding, there's a package here for bus funding, there's a package here for light rail, and they're all very welcome. But actually, it's how do you bring that together? How do you define the network that needs to be there? How can we bring those things into one package and then allow city regions to define them and compensate them appropriately? So I also think there's an opportunity, hopefully, to make a bit more of a push for integration rather than potential competition by mode in some of our cities.
Thank you, Laura. Now, some of the ways you can think about it in an integrated approach is the pricing, and to integrate the pricing and have the same platform offer you tickets as well as maybe a congestion fee or a parking fee. To have a sort of direct question here for you, in the Birmingham context, is the discussion about a potential congestion charge something that is increasingly on the table, or is that less the case?
A different mechanism, but a clean air zone charge will be being brought in. It's not the same as a congestion charge, but it has a lot of the same impacts. But it's based more about where we are exceeding air quality in our region, which is obviously increasingly important. But it's about all the things that we know that make the journey possible. So all the end-to-end information, the ticketing, the seamless nature, the integration of that network, alongside, if that's a carrot, then the stick of trying to restrict. So we need to think about things like parking, clean air zone charging, and those other mechanisms that dissuade people from driving where we don't want them to drive, and where there's a real, especially where there's a really strong public transport alternative. So that's not appropriate everywhere. If you can't get someplace on, you know, you need to have a good network. But where we do have those networks, we need to be looking at both ends of the spectrum on how we drive behavior change. Great.
Thank you very much. At this point, I do want to come to some questions which have slowly been building up. And the first one is by Hugh Jenkins. Hugh was wondering whether there is a risk of a two-class or two-tier society where the professional classes working in offices having access to essentially computer-based jobs will sort of benefit from online opportunity to access their jobs. And then you'll have those that are in other businesses relying on a less supported public transport system with reduced frequency and service quality. Is there a risk that we see sort of the bifurcation of ridership, which would, of course, I think, undermine one of the most important propositions of public transport, where we all tended to come together, at least in many European contexts? Mohamed, what is your sense on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's important really to diversify the offer in public transport, also to consider public transport to go beyond mass transit when we discuss about public transport. Really to consider public transport as a combination of all on-demand and shared mobility solutions, to make sure that we have a diversity of solutions that complement each other. So that we have, of course, mass transit will remain the backbone, but then we have also the other modes in a way that we can offer door-to-door solutions and not just station-to-station mobility solutions. And this will help people travel easily, but also will make them think less about owning a car, of using a car, or if they use a car, then it will be shared. So that's the kind of approach we should have about diversifying the mobility options in a way that we each, according to the time of the day, the purpose of the trip, etc., the profile of the users, they will use the right mode at the right moment. So that it's important. It will take time maybe, but this is also make the link with what Laura said about the importance of integration. Really, we should not approach public transport mode by mode. It's about offering a comprehensive mobility solution to people.
Thank you. And that builds a really nice bridge to another question by Rafael Cuesta, who is curious. And Laura, maybe from a experience out of the Midlands, why in the end, I mean, his assessment is we have been slow with mobility on-demand services, helping to flatten the car curve and, you know, ultimately inviting on-demand services to be part of the public transport spectrum. Why has this been stuck? Or is this your assessment as well? Could it be faster? Did we miss opportunities? Can we accelerate on this front?
I think we have been slow. I mean, because you can see how on-demand in a taxi sense has been well ahead of what on-demand in a public transport sense has been. And I think that we need to be sort of more radical in how we think about it. So we've just done a couple of interesting trials through one of our funding programs. So one where we are offering mobility credits if you agree to give up your car. So in exchange for a car that meets a certain standard of dirty diesel, £3,000 worth of mobility credits, which you can use across anything from car club, that whole range that Mohamed just set out of end to end. But I think it's about being willing to innovate in that space. But also, I come back to the sort of comment I made about mode. As long as we have modes in competition with each other, then adding in something new, like demand responsive, can be perceived to be a threat, a patronage threat, as opposed to building part of an integrated end-to-end network. So I think part of it is that nature that we've had to see modes as in competition with each other for the passenger, as opposed to thinking about how that fills in the gaps in our network, and in fact, you know, could be bringing people in that first end or last end of their journey onto the network, as complementary, not threatening.
Maybe one, I think one important issue, I'm not talking about Birmingham, of course, but generally speaking, one important issue is that the governance systems we have, they are not defined necessarily from the user perspective. So we define governance system which are based on modes or based on other considerations, but not taking into consideration the user perspective. And that's why we progress slowly. It's not just in Birmingham. It's all over the world, actually. I mean, this kind of combination between new mobility services and conventional public transport actually is something we all want, but we don't still succeed to find the right governance scheme to make this actors which are from the private and the public sector, but from startups and public monopolies, I would say, work together. I think this is very important challenge we have to address. We have to find a solution to that. And if we want to find a solution, we have to put ourselves from the look to transport from the user's perspective and define the solution that will make the travel of that user easier and convenient.
Thank you, Mohamed. And I want to stay with you also for the next question by John Carr, who wants to go back to, and you mentioned this earlier, the really important experience by public transport providers in the Far East, who had, of course, experienced SARS and MERS, and actually never went down this route of social distancing in public transport. Do you recall a moment where actually you were trying to connect, let's say European, maybe North American public transport providers with those in Asia to remind them about the relatively low risks? What happened there? Why didn't we learn enough from that experience? And moving forward, do we need just much better modelers working directly for us transport people?
What's interesting is that when we started here in Europe imposing face masks, for example, in public transport, those face masks were not imposed at that time in Hong Kong or in Singapore, because though they used to have face masks, I mean some passengers, so because they have a different experience with the because of the previous experience they had with SARS and MERS, etc. So of course I think it's maybe because they are more experienced in managing crowds there in the Far East, maybe because they had this first experience in 20 years ago, so they have a different approach to this crisis. They had a different approach to the crisis compared to the Europeans that are learning. So in UITP, of course, it's our role to try to share this experience, but then it's to those who will be implementing it to decide how to implement it, and sometimes there are psychological barriers that make this organization implement their actions differently from others. So I think it's more psychological. It's more about the acceptability also of the population. If the population will accept it, we see it now with this sanitary crisis about these lockdowns, that people are behaving differently from county to county. There are counties where people accept it easily and respect it, and other counties where people they don't accept it, and anyway they will not respect it. They are ready to pay fines for etc. etc. So I think the psychological element is very important.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, we need to bring this slowly to a close. There are many really interesting questions I would have loved to go through, but I now want to have just a final round, and first ask Laura and then Mohamed, if you think of the next 3-4 months up to the summer, what are going to be really important moments, issues, decisions, which may be indicative how we're getting it right or wrong in our cities and in relation to transport systems? Are there certain indicators, things you are very closely watching, wondering whether that's an indication of our future with collective transport? Laura.
Definitely patronage numbers we watch every single day on, whether, and that includes the roads, to understand where we are seeing patronage return. where I'll just give an example on our light rail system, where we now have a sort of a new afternoon peak, which is sort of a new time that we didn't really have before. And we're putting out extra vehicles at that time to try to make sure that there's enough capacity. Between now and summer, we do have a lot to do, and commented before on cleanliness and trust, but I also think we need a very clear campaign. Unfortunately, especially in this country, we sent out a lot of messages early on that gave people reason to think that public transport wasn't safe as far as marketing and advertising. And we now need to really focus on being able to communicate with passengers that when the time comes and they are ready to come back, we will be here safe, reliable, clean, and ready to take them where they need to be. I think it comes back to how we're going to be able to build back that trust. And as you know, trust takes a very long time to build and a very short time to lose. So making sure that we understand our pinch points, understanding, for example, when the kids went back to school, we've got certain areas of bus stations that get really quite busy with kids at certain times. Are we making sure that we've got safer travel police out at that location at the right time? So be driven by the data and what it tells us about where the pressures are, and then be incredibly thoughtful and careful about responding to those pressures in a way that at every opportunity is building people's confidence back in our network.
Thank you, Laura. And Mohamed, what are the decisions and numbers you will be watching over the coming months?
Actually, since the start of this pandemic a year ago, we started monitoring ridership in about 50 cities in the world, on all continents. And now we can even compare the ridership now compared to 2019, etc. And seeing the different evolutions and seeing how some cities are already at 80 or 85% of the ridership of pre-COVID, and others they are still at 40-50%. So this watching, I mean, the evolution of the ridership is for us a very, very good indicator of the resumption of the norm. I would say the new normal, not the normal. But what we will be watching, of course, is the evolution of the sanitary situation, because this will have an impact on ridership, on how public transport and when public transport will go back to people will go back to public transport. Sorry, so that's important. So and we are following this closely. And what I would like to say is really, whatever is the level of ridership in the coming month or even the coming years, what we see is the strong commitment and the sense of responsibility of public transport stakeholders, of public transport operators, the authorities, the supplying industry, in innovating, in developing solutions, in providing a service which will be more comfortable, more healthy, a service that is really answering the expectations of the travelers. So, and this will continue whatever is the ridership. And so the service, the improvement of the service, this is an obsession for public transport stakeholders. And this, of course, we will be following this closely and communicating about that.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I'll hand over to Jonathan in a second. Maybe just for me, this really important takeaway about the trust, the next few months of really showcasing that it can be done, good quality public transport, that is also affordable, and that's where we need national government and that will people make happy to return. Exploring the new experiments and making partnerships, ensuring also that we are moving fast beyond the thinking about individual transport modes and really treating the system, the transport system, as a collective that needs to be managed in an integrated way. And then, of course, the point about ultimately having new tools of communicating the value of public transport, of urban transport more generally, to policymakers, but also to the general public, which will lay the foundation for hopefully a new acceptance that this is indeed a public good. Jonathan, over to you. I also want to thank Laura and Mohamed. Really nice having talk to you today, but now over to Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Philip. And yeah, thanks to Laura, Mohamed and Philip for what was a fascinating discussion and conversation. I hope you'll be able to join us on the 29th of April for Urban Transport Next 05 on Sharing is Caring, about how shared mobility could play a bigger role in UK transport policy, how the UK could become a little less top gear and a bit more car share. So I hope you can join us for that. And in the meantime, thanks again to our panel, to everyone who took part live, for those who are listening to the podcast or watching the playback on YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.